Well, we're back this morning. It's good to be back after 4 weeks of new members classes, which were also excellent. But I've been excited to get back into our material this morning, considering we are going to cover in our class of church history probably one of my favorite areas. So that gives me some excitement, hopefully yourself as well. Just to remind our listeners online, we've been going through church history class, Reformation and Beyond. And today we've reached all the way up into, now I say that with some qualification because we're kind of going back in time a little bit this morning, but we're going all the way up into Puritanism in the 17th and 18th centuries. And we're going to cover the early portion of that. But again, I say backwards because we looked at the 30-Year War, which happens a little bit later, and some other events which took place later. So we are kind of going back in time a little bit this morning, but that's okay. Puritanism is what we'll be covering. If you were with us the last class, it was the 30 Years' War. And so today, Puritanism, excellent. English Puritanism, which is where we get that word from, although that doesn't mean those of similar conviction were not found across the world. So I want to cover lots of material as per usual this morning, so let's take as much of our time as we can. And I'd like to start just by a word of prayer. So let's bow our heads and pray for God's blessing on our class this morning. Father, I thank you for the special opportunity we have this morning to dive into such a notable period of your work in history. You have been working through all history. You have been preserving your word, and you've been giving us examples of Christians who are exemplary in their character by your grace and whom we can imitate. And this morning, I just pray that you would encourage our hearts as we consider more of this incredible period of history in the Puritans. Bless us and give me clarity as I communicate this information in Jesus' name. Amen. Just to remind you guys who are here, I know it's cold, but the heater is on, so just bear with us. A window was left open, so we're going to get warmer. But hopefully the blood will be stimulated in our brains and warm our bodies as we talk about Puritanism this morning. So let's get into it. Earliest appearance of Puritanism goes back a little bit farther than most people would think. You get later in time with the Great Ejection and a lot more Puritanism coming under Charles II. That is where probably Puritanism is most defined and really comes into its stride. However, I think that Puritanism, and many scholars agree, that Puritanism actually originates quite a bit before that. And I would say right around the reign of Mary Tudor. You're going to have to go a few classes back in your mind here. That was Bloody Mary, who put to death over 300 Christians, martyred them for their faith in opposition to Roman Catholicism. That's mid-16th century, okay? So it's a fair ways back. So we see quite a bit of Puritanism there, and then it grows in faith and conviction. Really, essentially, let me clarify, from the Reformation a little bit beyond, we really see that kind of Puritanistic mindset develop, which is kind of another way of saying reformer. But it just comes into its stride, as I said. Puritanism finds its real early origin as it starts to be fleshed out under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, especially. So 1558 to 1603, after Bloody Mary. She was Protestant. Again, you'll have to remember from our classes before, she was very tolerant to Protestants as a result. Her efforts to establish a uniform Protestant church really formalized that. But that's where you really get the origin of Anglicanism proper in that time. And it's in that context that although Anglicanism was a step ahead, a large step ahead in many ways, you still had a group of reformers that were continually dedicated to ongoing reform in the church. They weren't convinced that it was reformed enough, that there was still more to do. And that's where you start to get that Puritan word. It was actually derogatory of them, in a sense that, they continue to want more purity in the church. They're so serious about it. But I would say it's a great term to be used of for yourself. So they continue to want more and more reform, which is essentially a definition of Puritanism, want to purify the church. So purify continually. And they wanted to do that under Queen Elizabeth, who introduced a new version of the Common Book of Prayer, started to really want uniformity in the state church. She also played a crucial role in establishing the 39 Articles, which are great. But still, Anglicanism looked quite Romish at that time. It wasn't necessarily reformed. So it's in the midst of that we get early Puritanism developing. Now, as I say that, I think we have to sort of put away misconceptions of Puritanism for a moment. Many people, when they think of Puritans, they think of the Scarlet Letter. They think of, I think many people have quoted, I don't know who this are origins with, but someone who said a Puritan is someone who is upset that somebody somewhere might be having fun. And I don't agree with that at all. That's not at all the Puritans. The Puritans were obsessed with the glory of God transforming all of life. They preached more joyful sermons than anyone at that time. And in fact, they were against the rigidity and the formalistic behavior of the Anglican Church. And some of the great reformers were even known to wear various bright colors as they were professors at various seminaries. I mean, these were joyful men. They loved marriage. They loved the things of God. They loved even leisure. They loved wonderful, joyous things in God. That doesn't mean, obviously, that they weren't serious. They were very, very serious about the worship of Christ's church. And unfortunately, in the eyes of some, that was a negative thing. But to them and to us, this is a great thing. That is an error. That is not Puritanism proper. Okay, Puritanism is, again, the effort to seek to purify the church, and this was a good effort. Now, again, defining who and what in Puritanism is difficult throughout its time, because as you try to define Puritanism in the totality of its theological convictions, it really depends on what stage of history Puritanism was in, because earlier on in Puritanism, especially during the, obviously Queen Mary and then Queen Elizabeth especially, it's in its early form. It would be sort of a conglomerate of Presbyterian, Baptist, Congregationalist conviction. But amongst all of those various convictions was the common conviction that the church needed to be reformed continually, needed to be purified more. It was still reeked of the practices of Rome. You had in this period of Puritanism, early stages, those who are committed to stay in the confines of the Anglican Church to reform it, and then those who are convinced that they needed to separate entirely. And it's in those stages, 1620s, early 17th century, where you get, since we're close to Thanksgiving, you get Puritans that left England for the New World to establish themselves in America. And obviously we have various practices, or not necessarily traditions, but historical facts of the Indians and settlers, the Puritans, having great meals together as the Indians would help them understand the climate and how to navigate it. But Puritans, some separatists who were convinced at that time that they needed to form a new church separate from the state church, left. Yeah, you get Puritans leaving at that portion, known as separatists. So those would be more hardline Puritans. And then you'd have some that wanted to stay in England, and even stay within the confines of the Anglican Church to continue to reform it. Those would be more moderate. So that's why it's a little bit hard definitively to say that a Puritan is the one over here that totally opposes the Anglican Church, because it's not necessarily true. You had men even like John Owen, who stayed within the confines of the Anglican Church to seek to reform it. And then you had a nonconformist like John Bunyan, who was out preaching in the forests and would be locked up for 12 years because of his stance. So for that reason, it's a little bit difficult. However, I think later periods of Puritanism, the position becomes more concrete, more developed, especially when the Anglican Church, the state, presses hard upon Puritanism, and essentially it's impossible to stay within that church. And so many leave. And this is where you really get the Puritan stance as opposed to the conformist stance. So Puritanism is, well, we have to continue to reform the church. Mid-17th century going into 18th century. And then the conformist position, well, we're just going to be okay with the Anglican Church as it stands. That's a little bit of preliminary thoughts. But again, just to emphasize, Puritanism is the effort to purify the church. So let's look at Puritanism under King James. To start, King James the First. This is its earliest development, starting to get stronger. He is the successor to the throne after Elizabeth. So remember, Elizabeth, Protestant queen, starts to develop the Anglican Church and does give quite a bit of freedom to reformers, Puritans. Now, Elizabeth leaves no heir. So James is not her physical son. James is the son of Mary Stuart. Problematic, because Mary Stuart is a queen of Scotland who surrounds all form of conspiracy and is a supporter of Catholicism. So you can guess what that would do to Puritanism in England, as James, who was already king of Scotland, now comes over to take the throne in England, who's part of a Roman Catholic family. This doesn't look very good. Now, the Puritans are obviously very, very skeptical of what's going to happen under his rule. Thankfully, King James rules very much like Elizabeth. He's at least smart in that way in his policy. He knows he doesn't want to totally disrupt and break apart what's already established there. He would have called himself basically a Protestant, which is positive. After all, in Scotland, where he was ruling, Presbyterianism was on the rise. Scotland was virtually entirely Presbyterian, Protestant at that time. And so this is kind of a unique relationship with the Puritans as they look at King James, this man who could bring great positivity to England, who could give the kind of freedom and establishment of the Protestant church that happened in Scotland, in England, or he could go the other way and start to instigate Romish control. Because as much as he gave freedom to Protestantism, he wasn't really supportive of it. He really was more dedicated to establishing his own personal rule, which was problematic. And that's where his ambitions come in. James is a very politically ambitious man for the monarchy, and especially in a time where now we have Parliament operating within or together with the monarchy. So kings to be able to implement taxation or to receive funds for various projects must be approved by Parliament. So this is a unique relationship now in England. James is politically ambitious, and so sort of leverages the position of the Protestant, the Anglican Church at the time for his own power. Again, remember, Puritans aren't really happy with the state of the Anglican Church at this time. They don't want it. And Puritanism is on the rise. There's less and less satisfaction with the current episcopacy, which is the governmental powers of the church at that time. It's still very reminiscent of Rome. Even though it has Protestant theology, it looks like a Catholic church. It acts like a Catholic church, and there are many traditions which are still Catholic. However, that system supports a kingly rule. And James knows that, and so gives a lot of support to the episcopacy for that reason. He sees in the episcopacy a lot of opportunity for his own personal rule, so he supports it quite a bit. And he wants a monarchy like France. He wants more centralized government. He doesn't really like Parliament. He doesn't really like the House of Commons. He didn't really like Scotland where he was ruling because his Presbyterian subjects prevented him from achieving that rule. They pushed out the sovereignty of the monarchy. So he wants to achieve this in England. How is he going to do that? Well, he's going to support the episcopacy to accomplish these ends. And again, this causes great tension with the English Puritans. They don't like that. They want Scotland. Okay? They want to be free from that oversight. They want to be free from the tyranny of these traditions and be able to practice in accordance with Scripture. And at that time, many were convinced of a more Presbyterian model, much because of Scotland and other places as well. Just to give you some of the examples of what was sort of being enforced within the Episcopal Anglican Church at that time that Puritans had difficulty with, well, the use of the cross, the mandated use of the cross in worship. Puritans, iconoclasm comes in later, which is the going against of icons and statues in worship. So any image, according to Puritanism, and I have very similar convictions to a certain degree, what was wrong. So any icons, any images, and the use of the cross obviously had the image of Jesus Christ on the cross, which they fundamentally opposed. They believed this is a sinful thing. We cannot have the image of Christ. It needs to be taken down. There was the mandate also of priestly garments, vestments that had to be worn by pastors and bishops. They were commanded. Communion had to take place on an altar, so it still retained very much that Roman Catholic traditionalism. And the big one that's going to come into play later on in the Anglican Church is the mandated use of the common book of prayer. So if you're a pastor, you have to implement the common book of prayer. And Puritans believe fundamentally that this really restricted the freedoms of worship based upon conscience and the freedom of a naturalness in the service, so the freedom of the local church to determine the order of service themselves. So they refused these. They totally were against them, which obviously creates problems with King James's desires to create a more centralized rule. These Puritans are getting in the way. They're making a lot of problems. They're gaining a lot of support. This is where we get the appearance of distinct branches of Puritanism. Okay? Those advocating for biblical church governance free from the state. Okay? Here's where we get our line of thinking. Okay? Those advocating for biblical church governance free from the state were labeled independents. So here we go. We get a new branch, okay? A lot of Puritans had more Presbyterian convictions, but there were also within the confines of Puritanism those that were independent, who didn't believe there ought to be a state church at all, even if it was Presbyterian, that it should be up to the local assemblies to determine their system of governance free from the oversight of a state church. Much like what you would have in Anglicanism and the episcopacy. But even that, they just wanted the right to determine a governance system based upon conscience. And these were called independents. Independence is where we get the Baptist conviction. Okay, this is where we get much of our convictions as Baptists. You had within independence those who were against infant baptism, and those were obviously for a regenerate church member baptism. So you had to be saved to be baptized. And from those Baptist groups, you would have General Baptists who were Arminian in their soteriology, but you also had particular Baptists who were Calvinistic in their soteriology. They followed the line of the Reformers. And the particular Baptists are the more predominant ones. It's really with the controversy of the Arminianism in the Netherlands and then the confrontation of the Synod of Dort that reaffirms the truths of Scripture, where some of this came to play. And I don't want to draw too much of a tangent, but King Charles I is going to leverage some of the dispute between Puritans about an Arminian view of salvation and a Calvinistic view of salvation. Ultimately, Calvinistic view of salvation was the majority opinion, and it would continue. But we see those branches even in our Baptist conviction there in the 16th century and going into the 17th century. Okay, so here's a little bit about Presbyterianism, okay? There's some tension. James is kind of fighting a battle here with Puritanism. He gives a lot of freedom, but he still wants a centralized government, and so he supports the Episcopal Church because they support his more centralized government. Let's talk about ramping tensions, because we're actually going to get to war in history here. Big war. I know you all love hearing about war thus far, so we're going to talk about it again. Ramping tension. There were efforts to further affirm the episcopal hierarchy in the church by the king and through the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, wants more establishment of its church. It realizes Puritanism is on the rise and it's a threat. And the king wants to support the Episcopal Church, so he gives them the freedom to essentially continue to affirm their views. Various canons are enshrined, various confessions are made, again, to shore up the Anglican conviction that put pressure on Puritanism to conform. And this, even from a state level, implies a continual progressive rejection of many Protestant churches and Protestant belief. As the Episcopal Church grows, it begins to push out Protestant churches as those who don't align and therefore are not considered to be real, genuine churches because they don't conform to this Episcopal hierarchy or structure. And there are problems now in Parliament. Parliament has issues with this because Parliament at the time is not just made up of those who have the conviction of Anglicanism, but the conviction of Puritanism. In fact, Parliament is greatly made up of those of Puritan conviction. So you're going to see Parliament become a thorn in the flesh of the king over and over and over again. The House of Commons included many, many Puritans. So obviously, if the king wants to do anything, he wants to publicly affirm or give way or support to the Episcopal Church, he has to do so. If he's going to get support financially, certainly for doing so, he has to go through the House of Commons, which are going to become a problem for him. The House of Commons, here, to continue on here, there's an appeal by the Puritans in the House of Commons to the king in a session where there is the approval of various canons that officially support the Anglican Church. So the Puritans don't like this. This makes their churches on the outskirts. This defines their churches as wrong. And James wants to approve taxes. Yeah, he needs to make more money. He wants to make the country prosperous, and to do so, he needs to get Parliament's approval. But before that happens, Parliament brings to him, the House of Commons bring to him many of their concerns about his support of Anglicanism officially. And in this meeting, as the House of Commons and Puritans are voicing what they would like to see approved of in the freedom to practice church government in the form of a presbytery, in this conversation, the king actually slights them outright. He actually demeans their view as being equated to the relationship, a supposed relationship between God and the devil in the presbytery. This is no more alike than God is to the devil, essentially. So it's a total insult against Puritanism at that time. And so this session is not very successful in forming much support for the king. This early parliamentary session actually does, though, however, become a session that approves of the King James Version of the Bible that would come out later as a result, but not much else. And from this point onward, in this first sort of conflicted meeting in Parliament between King and Puritans, we just begin an ongoing cycle of a negative relationship between the two. Further anti-Puritan canons are introduced into the House, and the House continues to be in conflict with the king, who tries to avoid Parliament as much as he possibly can. But this is going to create the tensions, brothers and sisters, that are going to lead to an upcoming civil war. An upcoming civil war between the monarchy and the Parliament, which should be ruled by Puritanism. Okay, let's develop Puritanism under Charles I. Okay, so James dies, and we have Charles I introduced, who is far less lenient, I would say, to Puritanism than James is. He sees more of the divine rule of kings. He wants an even more centralized government than James does, and he is far more serious about that. And he shares, to an even greater extent, his father's constant conflict with Parliament as a result. So Charles I is sort of a loose cannon, especially at the beginning of his rule. People are trying to arrange a marriage that would be politically advantageous to him. He goes off and marries who he wants to. He goes and marries a sister of King Louis, the 11th to 13th of France. And, pardon me, this leads to concessions with English Catholics. This gets even worse. Charles isn't exactly making friends with Puritanism as he marries a basically Catholic woman, and that is to the disdain of Puritanism. His rule, therefore, is less and less tolerant to Puritanism. And there are many, many parliamentary issues, especially it all comes to a head in what was known as the trial of Richard Montague and Charles I. He was in support of this man who was a supporter of the Episcopal Church, and the Parliament also had many issues with him and was putting him on trial. So this to them was a criminal, and to the king was a great supporter. And in the midst of the trial, Charles the king sort of overthrows their authority and actually appoints this man, Montague, as his personal chaplain, which means he saves him from any imprisonment by Parliament. He essentially makes their authority null and void, exempt. And that creates a great combat between Parliament, Puritanism in Parliament, and the monarchy here. Montague was an enemy of Puritanism in Parliament. He was a proponent of the divine right of kings. So again, you can see why Puritans would oppose him. Now, you're going to hear this word quite a few times, I believe, this morning. The king dissolves the assembly. Okay, so he has the right to essentially just void, okay, we're stopping Parliament. No, he doesn't get anywhere. He doesn't get approval for funds, but essentially just closes the meeting and just ends the discussion. He dissolves this Parliament, okay, it's for a moment. He dissolves this meeting. Says, okay, no more conversation. We're done here. King dissolves the assembly to seek to abandon Parliament altogether. He's going to try to do that many times, but what he's going to find is that he needs the support of Parliament for the right to access funds. So he's going to find himself again back in Parliament trying to get support. Two more parliamentary assemblies are going to be dissolved by Charles after, I think, a 12-year period of trying to rule apart from Parliament. Parliament in the next meeting would demand to deal with grievances before any funding, okay? And essentially say, look, we have to deal with the issues of your opposition to the church and the belief of Puritanism and your support of the Episcopal Church. And the king ongoing dissolving assemblies only further solidifies Puritan camaraderie at this point. The king's rule is in despair with the people. There's lots of bad policies. He continues to dissolve Parliament over and over and over again until it even gets worse with a coming war with Scotland. So coming up to that, the king appointed a man named William Laud as archbishop. So this is where it really ramps up. Essentially, for the Episcopal Church, he appoints a man who is totally, even in greater support than the previous man who was put on trial for his beliefs, and makes him an archbishop. William Laud was a massive supporter of the Anglican Church. He loved all the ceremony, and he was adamant that all follow the practice of the common book of prayer and implement it. He was a firm advocate of conformity in Anglicanism, and he enforced that. And even King Charles, placing him in the position of archbishop, gave him control to implement them by force. Here's where you start to get actual persecution against Puritanism in England, where they're actually being tortured for their view. They're being hunted down. They're being killed in some places. And so this is obviously not helping the king's rule. And the king, obviously seeing that, wow, this really is cracking down on Puritanism in England, he gives William Laud, the archbishop, support to enforce the common book of prayer and Anglican practice in Scotland. Hey, now that I'm king of Scotland and England, go and do that in Scotland, where Presbyterianism Presbyterianism is in essentially full swing. There's many reformers, many Puritans there, and this is where you get a massive uprising and rebellion by the Scots. Now, they are far better at this than England. They are far more stubborn. They will not listen. They will not conform, which is excellent. I'm sure we could learn some lessons from that. This is where the Common Book of Prayer is put in force, and you have that instance in history, St. Giles Cathedral, where, I think the lady, I can't remember the lady, I think her name was Mary, actually picks up her stool, her three-pronged stool, and throws it at the bishop who is reading from the Common Book of Prayer behind the pulpit. And this strikes a riot and a rebellion in Scotland against the push of William Laud to conform in Anglicanism. Essentially, lots of wars, lots of fighting comes. And as a result of that effort in Scotland to oppose this, you would actually have the Covenanters. You might know that name, the Scottish Covenanters beginning to be formed. So it would come together and covenant based upon the supreme rule of Jesus Christ over the church, not the rule of William Laud, not the rule of King Charles, okay? And then later King Charles II. They were forced upon by Laud, but they would refuse, and they would actually, Scottish people would abolish the episcopacy and recognize official Presbyterianism later as a result of those rebellions. But there are wars coming from the Scots in the midst of that, and they come against the king, and they come against, obviously, the king because of his enforcement of Anglicanism through Laud. And so the Scots are angry, and the king knows war is on the horizon. And how is he going to get funds to fight this war against Scotland, who is angry about his rules of conformity? Well, he's got to go to Parliament, doesn't he? So he needs to get the support of the Puritans. Again, he needs the support of Puritans in the House of Commons. This is probably not looking very good. He goes to the Parliament to pursue funds for war with Scotland, and he dissolves it, again, because he receives no support, because guess what Parliament does? They say, well, you need to address the errors of your ways in mandating the Common Book of Prayer over the church and putting these men in the Episcopal Church that are harming and hurting Puritan people in our land. Of course, guess what he does? He dissolves it. That was what was known as the Short Parliament in English history, another short among many short parliaments. And after this parliament, the Scots actually invade England. Okay, they come to war, they bring it to the soil of King Charles. And here we go, that forces Charles, again, to convene Parliament, because now he really needs funds to support his war against the Scots. They're on their soil. And so he convenes Parliament for support. And this is what became known as the Long Parliament. Okay, the long one because it lasts a very long time, and the Puritans force his hand because they know he's in trouble. Parliament's going to take on a new face here. At this point, because of the king's rule and implementation, mandated force of the church, and even harm through William Laud of the Puritan people, reformers, Christians, Protestants, the House of Commons consists of far more people supportive of Puritanism than ever before. So there's even more support in the House of Commons and Parliament for Puritan ideals. They're discontent with the king's policy. And so they want to take steps to limit the king's power. And this is an advantageous point because they've got him, right? They've got him here because he has to get funds because the Scots are on their soil, which is interesting because in these meetings, Parliament is actually far more in support of the Scots, even though they're warring against England, than they are of the king. They want the king's power limited, and so they're going to hold Parliament as long as it takes to get the king to hear them out and give support to them. And so they do, actually. In fact, the king does listen, and he does agree to some of their conditions, and victims of William Laud are actually freed from prison. There's actually payments, buyouts for many Puritans that were mutilated by torture, and others put in prison for long periods who experienced much suffering, so they're paid back for all their experiences. And they even establish a law that prevents the dissolvement of Parliament without the agreement of Parliament itself. So now the king can't just dissolve Parliament anymore. The House of Commons actually has to agree to do so before the king can do that. Now, it's interesting because you might say, well, why would the king agree to that? Why would he actually allow that to go through? And what the Puritans in Parliament didn't really realize at that point was that Charles was actually conspiring with other people in the background there to force the hand or come against Parliament. He was actually talking to the Irish. There were instigated wars between Charles's wife, supporting Catholicism and trying to get Parliament booted out secretly. And so that would come to the attention of the Puritans and realize, oh, now we know why you're so quiet in Parliament, is because you're trying to instigate a lack of support and even a war against Parliament behind the scenes. This does not look good for the king. Things escalate, and the bishops that are in the House, because there still is support for the Anglican Church within the House of Commons, they are accused by the overwhelming number in the House, and they are actually banned entrance to Parliament. So no more of these bishops. Puritans in the House of Commons say, no more. We don't want your influence here. You're done. And as the king retaliates, he accuses the leaders of the House who sought to arrest the bishops, and he sends his troops to arrest them. As one of them was actually, I think, John Pym was one of the major leaders in the House of Commons who had the most influence for Puritanism, and the king tries to arrest him. But what happens is that the people and the armies within the confines of Parliament actually band together, and they bar the soldiers from arresting those members of the House of Commons. And so there's far more support for Puritanism than there is for the monarchy, and the king has to run away with his tail between his legs at this point. He overplays his hand, and he has to run and hide. And at this point, we've realized there's some big tensions now. The king is out of the picture, and now Parliament essentially rules by itself in the lack of the king. And so there's an appointment of John Pym, I believe, at this point to essentially rule sort of in a sub-monarchy position, but not entirely. And in the background, since Charles withdrew to his palaces, war is brewing. Civil war is brewing on the horizon. Charles is readying his own troops to fight against Parliament, and Parliament knows that he is going to rally troops, and so they rally their own troops to go and to fight in this civil war. It's just insane to consider just how this blew up, but it's a very interesting period of history. Civil War, we're going to see how far we can get here. Guys, if we have to cut it off, that's okay. Next week, I want to keep talking about Puritans and get a little bit more into that history, but I'll talk about this as much as I can. Battles ensue. So you have the parliamentary troops versus King Charles's troops, and there's some support being sought by either side. Parliament is seeking support from the Scots because they know they're Presbyterian, they're rebels against Anglicanism as it is. And what happens here, which is interesting, in Parliament's seeking to get support from the Scots, is they lean pretty heavily to Presbyterianism as a result. So you have far more influence for Presbyterian understanding of what was sought after to be a state church at that time. So Puritanism in Parliament is becoming more and more Presbyterian as a result. They want to support Presbyterianism there in England to get the support of the Scots, which they do. And they actually, at this point, abolish the episcopacy entirely. So they just get rid of the Anglican sort of state-mandated church control. And Charles, in the background, is trying to get the Catholic support in Ireland to get more battle support there for his troops. And it's in the midst of this, I'll talk a little bit more about those wars in a moment. It's in the midst of this that as Parliament becomes more and more refined in their theological views, more and more Puritan and more Presbyterian, that the Westminster Assembly is actually formed in this time. It would be enacted officially in 1644, but because the convictions were becoming more and more Presbyterian too as well, Parliament would convoke a body of theologians to advise it on theological matters, and so officially support this. And you can see why this would gain a lot of support of the Scots as well, because majorly being Presbyterian. But now that Parliament's becoming more and more theological, they want an official statement of faith now that they've abolished the Episcopal Church. Okay, well, what do we believe about the church? What do we believe about theology and the governments of church? It's an incredible statement of faith. An incredible confession, one that you need to read, one that really formed the basis of the later enactment of the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which would obviously align more with our convictions. But still, nonetheless, Westminster really paved the way here. It was crafted by 121 ministers, 30 laymen, and 8 representatives from Scotland. You can see that influence coming in. This is the most fundamental Reformed Calvinistic confession of orthodoxy that there is, I still think, to this day. Okay, that was enacted in 1644. And in the following year, you have all this going on. There's some wars, skirmishes going on in the background between the King's army and the parliamentary Puritan army. The following year, after the Westminster Confession is released, you have the ordering of William Laud actually executed. So there you go. Bye-bye, episcopacy. Killed the archbishop of the church. And here's where we see, and this is probably where we're going to end this morning, the introduction of Oliver Cromwell, a very disputed, interesting figure in Puritanism. If you ask me my personal convictions, I think a lot of what he did was very good and is actually instructive in many ways, perhaps for our time. But you can make your own decision on that. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan member of the House of Commons and massively instrumental in the parliamentary victory against the king. Okay, so they're still fighting a war. But Oliver Cromwell, in the name of God, put together his own army, which would become a force to be reckoned with against the king's army, and would find incredible support. In fact, he had great cavalry, cannons, and other things that were a great power force against the king's cavalry because he had lots of money. So they battled, and Oliver Cromwell became a great victory for the parliamentary forces. It led to that victory against the king ultimately, who would eventually be placed under parliamentary arrest. So eventually, after these battles under the Cromwellian army against the king's forces, they would finally get the king. He would be captured, and while he was captured, Parliament essentially wins under the help of Oliver Cromwell, who's sort of the protector of England at that time, and Parliament would adopt various Puritan laws and observances more seriously now that they were free from the monarchy. We're going to talk next week about the beheading of the king, because he's not yet killed, the continual work of Cromwell in England and his attempts to sort of republicanize England in a sense. But we're going to get there next week because we just don't have the time, and I think we're all out this morning. So we're going to end with Oliver Cromwell and how he was a force for Puritanism, and we'll get to the rest next week. Let's bow our heads as we close for a word of prayer.